Hey everyone, just before we get started, I wanted to say that we know that this has been a really unbelievable week. And like you, we've been watching in horror as Ukraine has been faced with a brutal and unprovoked invasion. We're in awe of the courage of the people of Ukraine, and we stand firmly with them as we pray that freedom and peace will prevail. While we thought that it would be best to release this conversation with Terrel on our regular schedule, we just wanted you to know where our hearts are and that we're planning on bringing in some voices soon to help us think through these events. We're sending our love to each of you.
Hey everybody, this is Tim Chavez from Faith Matters. For today's episode, we talked with Terryl Givens about his new book, The Doors of Faith. We know that many of you are familiar with Terrell's long career as a great thinker and theologian in our faith, and that you may be familiar with his many appearances on this podcast, both as host and guest. But for any new podcast listeners, we thought we'd share again just a little bit of his background here. Terrell is a New York native who did graduate work in intellectual history at Cornell and in comparative literature at UNC Chapel Hill. Prior to his current position, he was the Jabez A. Bostwick Chair of English and a professor of literature and religion at the University of Richmond. He now serves as Neil A. Maxwell Senior Research Fellow at BYU's Maxwell Institute. Prior to releasing The Doors of Faith, Terrell published over 20 other books. He and his wife Fiona are the co-authors of 4 books: The God Who Weeps, The Christ Who Heals, The Crucible of Doubt, and of course, All Things New, which was published by Faith Matters Publishing. The Doors of Faith, which was published by the Maxwell Institute and Deseret Book, comes from a series of 4 lectures Terrell gave at BYU that were extraordinarily popular and well-received. The lectures then evolved into this book. In our conversation with him, Terrell shared so many insights, but some of the most memorable for us included how rationality can play a role in and augment our religious lives, how many Latter-day Saint doctrines once thought of as heresies are actually being embraced by the larger Christian world, and how faith can help, in Terrell's words, give us access to a broader reality. We really loved talking with Terrell, as we always do, and we really hope that you enjoy this conversation. Okay, Terrell, thank you so much for joining us again.
Hi again.
We're very excited to talk about this new book of yours, The Doors of Faith. It seems like you're releasing a book, every few weeks at this point?
It sometimes feels like that, but I think the pipeline is now empty.
Okay.
Well, almost.
Maybe you could start by telling us, this originally began as a lecture series at BYU, did it not?
Correct.
Could you give us sort of the background and how this book came to be?
Yeah, I was recruited by BYU, and after overcoming the fierce objections of my wife, we eventually conceded to the inevitable. And as soon as we came, the academic vice president, wonderful man, John Rosenberg, recognizing the extent of faith challenges for this generation and feeling that BYU needed to do more in a concerted kind of way to address tough questions of the moment, asked me if I would be willing to give a series of 4 lectures on the topic of faith. And so I did that in the fall of 2019 in the Varsity Theater.
And the title itself, The Doors of Faith, what is that in reference to?
Yeah, that, to my mind, is just a really rich image that I made the focus of this book by inverting the traditional meaning of that phrase. Right? Luke talks about the doors of faith being open to the Gentiles, in which he seems to be indicating that the gospel has gone from just the Jews now to the whole world. So it's like we open the doors to you. But it occurs to me that the most important thing about faith is that it opens the doors of our own mind to other possibilities. And so my basic premise about faith is that the world is way too multi-layered. Reality has too many dimensions to it to think that just science or just logic can capture the entirety of reality. And so faith to me is just a willingness to be open to other ways of knowing, in addition to reason, in addition to logic. And I think in that sense, faith gives us access to a broader reality.
There was a part I really, really loved, just this idea about openness and how an expression of faith can look like openness. But I just wondered, is there a point where too much openness is actually just kills your faith? That is this the beginning of a slippery slope to nihilism? And I think we kind of have this, we entertain this sentiment a lot at church, and there's this idea that you have to be careful about what you read, and learning can be dangerous, and so I'm curious if you think there's ever a case where learning is dangerous.
I think learning is always dangerous.
Ooh.
And I think that's we have to accustom ourselves to that early on. And what I mean by that is, going outside of the garden was dangerous, and discovering the principle of nuclear fission was dangerous, and learning about the birds and the bees as a teenager is dangerous. So learning always opens to us more possibilities and more options. And those options are always going to be divided between happy outcomes and tragic outcomes. And so I think, we just need to, right off the bat, accept that learning is always a dangerous enterprise.
That's such a good point.
You say it in that sort of same section that we should welcome, I believe is the term you use, challenges to our faith, which I think is a viewpoint that traditionally is not shared by many within the church. I think many see those challenges as things to be avoided, to say, oh, I can't listen to that, or I can't read that, that type of thing.
Well, I think that we don't often treat our testimonies as the organic things that they are. And so I talk a lot about epistemological humility.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is a recognition that our certainties should mostly be tenuous certainties, provisional certainties. And so I think that we should be anxious for opportunities to deepen our commitments and our convictions, and that can only happen when they're challenged. And I think one reason why we suffer the defections that we do in the numbers that we do is because we have this language of certainty and wholeness that creates the false impression that once you buy those initial propositions you hear in the first missionary discussions, that's it. You've reached this point of plenitude, and there's no reason to ever challenge or expand upon that. And so I would make a distinction. So let me say this about faith, right? That faith is a complex word with a complex history. And in the Old Testament, what we call faith is generally more accurately translated as faithfulness. Right? Abraham is faithful to God. He's faithful to the covenant, to the promises. And so faithfulness always has to do with relationship. And it's about steadfastness and loyalty in a relationship. In the New Testament and subsequent theology, faith acquires the denotations of assent to a set of propositions. So in the church, it would be, I have faith Joseph was a prophet. I have faith the Book of Mormon was translated. And those are two different things, right? And they might be interconnected. I think they are, but they're separate things. So I guess I would say the first should be unwavering and inflexible. My commitment to Christ is permanent and entrenched, and nothing is going to challenge that. But how I understand translation and what we mean when we say Joseph is a prophet, and what true and living, those are all subject to negotiation and amplification and further exploration. So I don't think that challenges to one should affect the faithfulness associated with the other.
Wow, yeah.
I want to, in the same area, you talk about discipleship, saying that, and it sounds like, I think this was based on what you said Thomas Traherne has written, that discipleship should be offered both willingly and wittingly. That reminded me, actually, I mean, I've also heard critics of the church say that all they want, is for people in the church to be involved with informed consent. And informed consent and willingly and wittingly are essentially the same thing, right? Informed is witting and consent is willing, right?
Well, I think what I want to say about this, right? A lot of controversy has been engendered by the topic of, what questions are worth asking? And I guess the one thing that I would recommend is always make sure your questions are your questions. And too often we're just kind of picking up other people's questions that suddenly, right, titillate us or interest us. And it's like, well, what questions matter to you? So Christ's resurrection on Easter morn is an assertion of a historical fact. And if that's wrong, then all Christianity is just a pious fiction. But whether he was born in Bethlehem or Nazareth, and whether the Last Supper took place the day before Passover, as John says, or on Passover, as Matthew Mark, I don't think those are as high stakes. And so I think we have to make a differentiation between the kinds of questions and what's at stake.
Yeah.
And stop being distracted by irrelevancies and ask the real questions. Did Joseph Smith really have an experience of God? Did he really restore this incredible understanding of the nature of God and of human origins and destinies? Is there something about temple theology and the framework of the church that makes God present to us in a way that he wasn't before? Those are the questions that I think we have to be asking.
So I imagine that this is an experience a lot of listeners have probably had, where you do think you come across a question and maybe someone asks you, or, it just comes into your mind and you may feel curiosity piqued, but I think the overwhelming sensation for a lot of people is just dread and fear. Like they are so afraid to look into this question. And so maybe it is not maybe it's not the most important question, but it's causing this real sense of disequilibrium and worry that, if the answer to this one question changes my relationship with the other answers to the questions, then like I have a real problem here. Yeah. So I would love for you to talk about that, like when you were in that situation, because I think that there's a way to listen to conference talks and feel like what you're supposed to do is ignore the question or just stay away from it, or focus on the faithfulness and focus on the covenant path and stop worrying about these secondary questions. And so what I want to know from you is like, is it fruitful to be open to those questions? Like just because of the fact that it's causing you fear and dread, like is it fruitful to explore those?
Well, and I think a lot of people feel like their answers to the first questions, the primary questions, the things of most importance, they're there because of where they were with the secondary questions. Like my faith in God alone is based on what I believed or have believed all my life about Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. And so those attacks really do cause a domino effect for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think they do if we never get to the point of relegating the role of the church and church history to the ancillary function that it was always supposed to provide, right? The end result is not supposed to be a commitment to the church. The end result is supposed to be knowing Christ.
Yeah.
But in our consciousness and our rhetoric and our language and our curriculum, the church assumes such dominance that, we should know something's wrong when the almost universal pattern is people say they're leaving the church, not they're leaving Christ.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
So it would be a completely different matter if people said, I just can't buy this resurrection anymore. Well, okay, that's at least a problem that is real and meaningful. But horses in the Book of Mormon? What's that's what your life is built around? And so I think to that extent, it's a question of kind of prioritizing what our religion should mean and where our focus should be.
And is that on us or?
Well, I think I think it is largely. I mean, there's no question that we have reposed too high of expectations in the institution. I think the first leader to recognize this was Elder Packer. He spoke about this powerfully many times back in the 70s and 80s. He would say, the church is not a pharmacy that has a medicine for all your needs, right? We've got to have a degree of spiritual self-reliance and independence, and the church is there as a resource. I think I think the genius behind the Come Follow Me program is I think that's the church's way of saying, no, we're going to reposition that responsibility in the home.
Yeah.
And in the family. So, Nathaniel, my son, likes to say the church isn't a Swiss Army knife.
Yeah.
But we think it's supposed to have a solution for every problem and every challenge.
Yeah.
So we need to think of our discipleship in terms of Christ. And I'm sure the institution can do more, and we can do more as individuals to make that happen.
Let's talk for a bit about maybe developing faith. I think the traditional way of looking at this from a Latter-day Saint perspective is, Moroni's promise, read the scriptures, ask, receive, and just sort of continue in that cycle. And I think that's, I think there's definitely something to that. One of my favorite quotes that you brought up in the book was from John Milton. If one believes because his pastor said so, the very truth he holds becomes his heresy. Yeah. What do you think? What do you think he meant by that?
I think what he meant was that we have historically, all the Gallup polls, all the Pew surveys, they all confuse affiliation with conversion, right? It's like, do you attend church? And that's supposed to be a sign of belief. And I think contrary to what kind of the standard line is, I think belief has become too easy in the modern world. It hasn't become too hard, right? You can't run for president if you're not a Christian, for heaven's sakes. So to pretend that it's this obstacle that we have to, in the secular, no, you still get a lot of social capital for believing, well, for affiliating. And sure. I guess that's what I'm saying is that we have to make our faith our own. We have to own it. And I think one obstacle here is that I think all faith has to be costly. If it's not costly, then it's just a kind of casual assent to a set of propositions. And that's how most of us experience the church most of our lives. It's comfortable. It's a socially, congenial place, and our family raised us that way. And until we know what price we're willing to pay, either in terms of capital or in terms of personal investment or spiritual agony or questing, then we haven't made it our own. I think that's what Milton was saying.
Yeah.
Was if you believe the right thing, or if you assent to the right thing, but it isn't an act of vital faith, that doesn't count for anything. It's just you just won the lottery. You get to heaven because you picked the right winner.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a pretty.
Do you think that belief and faith are useful as synonymous or roughly synonymous terms?
One problem with trying to define a term like faith is that it presupposes there is a right answer, right? And we shape vocabulary to suit our needs. And so for me, it's most useful to think of faith as a response. And that's how I would differentiate faith from belief. I can just choose a belief at random or because I read or heard. But if we really believe in the divine presence, if we really believe there is a personal God and a spirit who make their will and natures known to us, then I think there is this omnipresent voice. So can I tell a story? I'm going to tell a story. So back before Abraham Lincoln even gave his inaugural address, there was a Frenchman working to see if there was a way to record the human voice. This is before Edison. And he perfected this machine. This is actual fact. He perfected this machine. What do you call the autophonograph, something like that. And it pretty much on the same principle that Edison would later find, right? That it was this needle and it kind of like a seismograph. It would record perturbations caused by sound waves of the human voice. It worked perfectly. The only problem was he couldn't figure out a way to decipher it. So he could record you, and so you've got this sheet with all these lines on it, but what to do with it? And so he gave up, and he died. Just a few years ago, in the early 21st century, there were some scholars researching in the Paris archives, and they came across these graphs. And they kind of figured out what they were. And they just thought, well, this is interesting. And one of the guys goes home, and he can't stop thinking about this. Then it occurs to him, we could digitize those lines and convert it to sound. Yeah. And so he goes back the next day, and they digitize these records, and they play it. And it's just kind of this indecipherable static. And he's about to give up, and then he thinks, maybe we're playing at the wrong speed. So he alters the speed, and suddenly you hear this Frenchman singing a song.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And I think that is just the most perfect kind of trope for the divine voice. It's always there. But how do we discover a way to be open to that? Yeah. And I think faith is that gesture of responding and saying, I hear something and I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt because what I hear is beautiful and praiseworthy and reasonable, if not certain. Yeah. And
excuse me.
No, that's it.
I saw this morning that Richard Rohr had an article on faith, and he said, I think something like basic religious faith is the affirmation that God is inherent in all things and that this is all going somewhere good. And that's something that really resonated with me. Yeah. Because like the list the list of propositions, that doesn't always work for me. It depends on the day, I think.
Yeah.
But like, I have felt deep in my being the difference between an affirmation that this is all going somewhere good and that it's all just meaningless. The nihilism that creeps in at times.
Yeah, well, I like that. I'm not, he's an immanentist, right? So yeah, there's a sense in which God infuses everything. Section 88 maybe, but I find that the one thing I grow more and more certain of as I get older is that this is all going somewhere good. Mm-hmm. But what I love about the gospel is it explains why. It gives us a way of making sense of pain and suffering and education while convincing us that there's a rational grounds for believing that this is purposeful and meaningful. And I think that's one of the great glories of Joseph Smith's vision, right? Is that it isn't this test,
right? And
this really kind of, I think, just this terrible way, like we're trained dogs and we're going to get a treat if we jump through the hoop. No, we are, right? I mean, there are two kinds of tests, right? In education, there's the summative test to just see, did you pass? Mm-hmm. Or there's the formative test. Okay, let's find out what you still need to do. And so I think, right, Joseph Smith taught us, no, this is a formative test.
Yeah.
So there's reason to be optimistic only if God has a way of bringing the entirety of the human family back to him. So short of that universal accessibility of salvation, then it isn't necessarily going in a good direction.
Yeah. I love, you talk about, is it John Harris, the poet? Yeah, who talks about how the role of parents and teachers is to work themselves out of the job.
Yeah.
And by extension, isn't that God's role to become less and less needed? And that was really profound. Like, I love that idea because it kind of leaves some room for this idea that uncertainty could be a part of our real development. And, I expect more certainty, like the closer to God I am. And I loved this idea of flipping that paradigm upside down and thinking, what if that's God's objective for me to be independent, then
I think this is an idea that takes us onto really thin ice, right? And so I think it needs to be carefully dealt with. And so let me offer a few points of clarification.
Okay.
Because this is great. We talked about this in class yesterday. So students said, so that means that if I have my own personal witness, I can ignore everything, right, the church teaches or right, scriptures say. And I don't think that's quite the independence we're talking about. But here's what I think we are being told. Look, I had a friend, right, who once boasted in a sacrament meeting talk that they even prayed about the color of the van that they were going to buy next.
Oh, wow.
Right? Well, it's not that example itself that is problematic. It's what it represents about a certain stance, that we think God has everything plotted out and we just need to follow that script that has been written for us. That's Calvinist, right? That's predestinitarian. Yeah. And I think that God, it isn't that, look, when we get to celestial kingdom, are we still going to be asking, okay, what are the laws I need to? Laws are to shape us into God's nature. Laws are to train us in having the same appetites that he has, to love the same things that he has. So my understanding is that the point we want to attain to eventually is that we love the same kinds of things he loves. And so we don't always have to be asking, should I do this? Should I do this? Should I?
Yeah.
It arises out of a nature that is God-like.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that's going to happen anytime in this life, but I think that's the long-range idea. And if we have that in mind, then it gives a whole different feel to the way we're relating to God. He's not sovereign and we're the subjects, right? He's the Father and he's trying to teach us to acquire a kind of independence and autonomy and to assimilate those values.
Yeah. My dad growing up always talked about playing scales versus playing music.
Yes.
We need like some scaffolding and like some structure, but then it's to make it so that, the point is not the scales. The point is to play something beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's
we have to learn skills
analogy
first.
Yeah. And I think once we get to that point, God wants us to make our own music, not just play his.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe not the color of the van, but should you get a van at all? Maybe is the question.
That's right.
So you there was a very interesting section of the book where you talked about rationality. I think the world, I mean, much of the world, I hate using that phrase the way we use it often, as a pejorative, but many modern thinking people use rationality as the primary, if not only, way to find truth. If you go and listen to the mystics, then they're talking about other ways of finding truth. I've never thought of you as much of a mystic, but I got a little bit of maybe mysticism as I read through this.
Well, I think there are two problems with rationalism, with overhyping rationalism. One is every evolutionary biologist practically in the game today is saying, look, evolutionary biology gives us no grounds for believing that we have access to truth. Our minds and brains developed as survival mechanisms to ensure our propagation. Whether what we see as truth corresponds to some ultimate reality is beyond the scope of evolution. So, right, in kind of empirical scientific ways, we have no basis for having faith in rationality as a key to absolute truths. But then I think more importantly, empirically, we just know that's not the case, right? Yeah. I'm assuming you asked for her hand in marriage.
That's correct, yes.
Did you make a list of all the pros and cons and do a kind of cost-benefit analysis?
Do you want me to answer that honestly? I kid. No, of course not. Of course not.
So right, in life's most important transactions, we don't rely upon pure reason. Now, certainly there are rational factors that come into play, right? If she were already married and had 11 kids, then that might have been a reason to pause. But we respond to abuse and holocausts in a way that doesn't derive from rational analysis, right? I mean, Hitler's rational analysis made perfect sense, right? Darwinian science, let's just eradicate, right, what we think are inferior. And so we know that. We live by forms of knowing, ways of knowing that transcend the rational or supplement the rational. So that's all I'm saying. I'm not a fideist, right? Fideism is the belief that we don't trust reason and we just rely on faith.
Sure.
No, this is one of the remarkable things about the language of the Doctrine and Covenants is how often it conjoins heart and mind, heart and mind. And I think that's sane. Intuitive faculties and rational faculties, they have to be synthesized.
So that process that I brought up earlier, the sort of stereotypical Moroni's promise, is that a rationalist method in some ways? Like what I'm really doing there is running an experiment and gathering evidence and basing my belief on that evidence.
Well, it's interesting that, right, in the 19th century, right, America kind of comes late to the Enlightenment, but there is a sense of Enlightenment religion in the 19th century. And so most early Mormons thought of Mormonism as a rational religion.
Oh, interesting.
Because it relied so much upon personal experience. And so there's no doubt that Alma speaks in similar language, right? Yep. Experiment upon the word. So I think, what defines the scientific method is not that it relies upon evidence or experience. That's a red herring. What defines scientific method is the way in which evidence is construed, what counts as evidence, and is the experiment replicable in a public way, right? So things like that tend to have shaped what we call the scientific method. But we've lost the argument if we already enter into it, embracing the language and the definitions of a materialistic culture. So we have to believe that what I'm experiencing in my response to prayers or pondering or reading the voice of a prophet or Julian of Norwich, that's real, it's discernible in Alma's language, so it certainly constitutes evidence.
Yeah. I'm curious more though. I mean, I feel like rationality has expanded my spirituality in a lot of ways. Like I feel like my faith, it feels deeper and more solid because I looked into rational problems, I think that my faith was a lot more fragile when I was afraid to learn about things that were not necessarily feeling things. Like I did really have big, scary questions about church history, but learning about that, and it gave me a more solid trust. And so you, I mean, as an actual scholar, like I'm curious how rationalism has either, do you feel like you believe in spite of it or that it is somehow like feeding your spiritual life?
Absolutely, it feeds it, right? So let me give you two examples. And this is kind of circling back. I realize now we didn't really answer your question about right, dangerous questions and fear. So when I set out to write my second book in Mormon studies on the Book of Mormon, I decided, look, this had never been done in an academic way. There's only propaganda on both sides. And so I thought, so how does one write for a university press a book about the Book of Mormon?
Yeah.
And I thought, well, a reception history would make the most sense. In other words, we just talk about it in terms of how was it understood and reviewed and treated and the influence it had on religious culture. So that's how I proceeded. But in order to accomplish that, I had to deliberately try to read every single attack on the Book of Mormon that had been written between 1830 and the present. Now, that's probably not possible today, but it was closer to possible in 2000, the year 2000.
Sure.
And so many friends were alarmed at this, right? You're going to expose yourself to every attack on the Book of Mormon? And my answer was always the same. It was, if the Book of Mormon can't withstand that kind of scrutiny, it doesn't deserve my loyalty. And so I have to believe that. And I think as Latter-day Saints, we have to remember the words. I think it was Elder Eyring's father who said, you'll never have to believe anything that isn't true. And so if we just take that
relax
and relax
yeah.
and don't be afraid.
Yeah.
If the church can't withstand the toughest scrutiny and investigations, then it doesn't deserve our discipleship or our loyalty. So
yeah.
I take it as a given that it can and that it will, and I've put that to the test many times. Now, when I wrote my 2-volume history of Latter-day Saint theology, right, again, I'm writing for an academic world audience and an academic press. So there was nothing devotional or evangelistic about that work. It was a strictly kind of rational study and organization and systematization of the history of LDS thought. And there wasn't a page I wrote that didn't enhance my faith and belief because of what I saw as the most fully rational theological system that I've ever encountered. I mean, right, I love the Catholic Church, wonderful tradition, beautiful tradition, beliefs, people. But come on, in the year 2013, for the very first time, they issue a papal statement on the hope of salvation of children who die unbaptized. Where's the rationality in a system that assigns infants to damnation? So that's what
Yeah,
it seems to me that,
yeah.
that the universality of the plan, the coherence of the pre-existence with the post, to my mind, it's intellectually symmetrical, coherent, and consistent. And there are little rough edges here and there, but overall, it's astounding.
And at some point, it seems like your own experience will start becoming part of this rational argument. And I liked when you talked about how, I'm sure you've had multiple people come to you over the years about the Book of Abraham, and you mentioned in the book that is a deal breaker for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I like that little example because this is a book that you and Fiona have written so much about, and the Book of Moses, and that's where we get this God who weeps. And so at some point it's like that is so much the God I believe in, like that can keep this rational for me, even if the papyrus was a funeral text, And I like this idea that like the most important question eventually comes back to my experience with the church and how it is functioning as a vehicle to connect me to God. And I think what I was learning from that section about Book of Abraham is just, you can really get in the muck of apologetics, and I call it, that's probably going to offend people, but that was not satisfying to me. But what tastes good to me is a God who weeps. And so I like this idea that we don't have to be afraid of how the Book of Abraham, or whatever the problem is, however those things came to be, that those can have problems. And what is important to me is the way it connects me to God. And and I would just add to that the problems with the Book of Abraham are not the problems with the text, they're the problems with the narrative we have constructed around the text.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that should be the first thing that we suspect is, maybe we didn't correctly understand the process by which
maybe Joseph didn't correctly understand the process.
Maybe Joseph didn't. And that horrifies some people. And I say, look, Paul said he couldn't tell if he was in the body or out of the body when he had his visions.
Yeah.
So clearly there's something about the nature of revelatory experience that is not always kind of fully understandable in our own terms.
It seems that you are affirming that, for you at least, the church, the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, Joseph Smith, they need to and can stand up to the highest level of scrutiny. But it's probably important to define the bar by which we're measuring that, right? Like if the bar is infallibility or inerrancy or whatever, kind of like what you were talking about before, the church, it may not stand up to the highest level of scrutiny if it is the central part of our faith, of our spiritual life.
That's right.
Right.
If it's inerrancy, is what everything hinges on. Yeah. I get that.
One of the really interesting parts of the book for me was that you talked about how traditional Latter-day Saint heresies have become orthodoxy in larger Christendom, and you had several examples. Would you mind talking about a few of those? I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah. So let me go through a short list. So Latter-day Saints are absolutely unique, I believe, in the Christian world in believing that Adam and Eve's expulsion was an act of mercy, right? That it wasn't a jealous, angry God, and that there was some divine plan behind their ascent rather than fall.
Right. Just
today, a friend sent me this quotation from a very recent commentary on the Bible by, a non-Latter-day Saint scholar. He said, traditional interpretation, especially Christian, refers to this act of transgression as signaling the fall of man, though the expression nowhere occurs in the text. But if we read anthropologically, and I'm a wisdom-seeking spirit, what we have here instead is in fact the rise of man to his mature humanity.
That's fascinating.
So it's still not universal, but when here's, I think, a lot of gestures that move in that direction. Yeah. Teachings about original guilt, right? In the 18th century, it was said by one theologian that was the linchpin and the most fundamental principle of the Christian religion was acceptance of original guilt.
Wow.
And to that, I only have to respond, try to find somebody today in the Christian world who affirms original guilt. You'll find a few diehard Calvinists, but the vast majority of Christianity has long ago jettisoned original guilt for Adam's sin. They don't talk in terms of original guilt. Man becoming God, or what we call theosis. Christianity Today ran an article a few years ago saying we have to recover the early Christian teaching of theosis. The Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, never abandoned it. They still talk about it regularly and frequently.
Was it Origen in the early Eastern Church that had a theosis theology?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and so did many of the early church fathers. Although, they didn't render it as explicitly as we do, and not in the exact same terms, but some conception of a divine ascent. Life as educative or a tiered salvation. The Catholics have abandoned limbo, and Pope John Paul II said things in public before his death that indicated he thought the Catholic Church had to find some way to be more universalist in its salvation. Evangelicals, very prominent evangelicals like Rob Bell, have sold millions of copies of their books by challenging the limited salvation of evangelicals and saying, we have to get this wrong. His famous quotation was, do we really think somebody's going to go to hell because a missionary got a flat tire?
Yeah.
So the whole Christian world is revisiting this question. The Father suffers and has pity and compassion. That even has its own name as a heresy, right? Patripassianism. And scholars now say that in the late 19th century, there was a sea change, right? In the creeds, God cannot have passion. He's without passion, which means he can't be moved by our experiences. And now you got books on every Christian bookshelf, the most moved mover, God the vulnerable, right? And so sea change in that direction. Joseph Smith was the first to articulate it in Scripture and canonize that teaching. Divine corporeality, the fact that God has a body. Recent book just came out by the German scholar Christoph Marschis. It's making all kinds of waves. In it, he says, it was only with the advent of medieval Christianity that the idea that God has a body became scandalous.
Wow.
So it's now recognized that lots of the early Christians taught and believed this. Stephen Webb wrote a whole book on this, Heavenly Flesh.
Wow.
We could talk about temple worship and temple theology, right? And Christians have yet to build their own temples like Latter-day Saints, but Christian scholars, by and large, are now saying we have to reevaluate the role of the temple in early Christianity, because clearly in the New Testament, the apostles are still worshiping there.
Wow. Yeah.
So we have to rethink what was its role and what might it be for us.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
You have such a beautiful way of saying this, and I don't know if I have it in my notes, but you say that the restoration is the most morally, I'm going to slaughter it here. Do you know what I'm talking about? You have
yeah, I don't remember
the most morally
exactly.
compelling,
intellectually satisfying,
intellectually satisfying,
and aesthetically appealing.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Right.
Yeah, I really believe that's true.
Yeah. I have one. I feel like that feels like a good place to end, but I have to ask you about this because this was my favorite part. You talk about how, evolution in any context, biological, spiritual, any kind of evolution is fueled by tension. And so I want a pep talk for anyone who is having a hard time with that at church. I think we talk about the Sabbath, like, we want it to be a delight, and we want our church experience to be restful, and we want it to be a respite and like a couple of hours of recovery. But I think for a lot of people who are experiencing any sort of dissonance, those 2 hours at church might be the most painful of their week. And it might be the time when what's that amazing Brigham Young quote? You say something about like all of your faults will be made manifest or something. The point of the gospel is to make all your faults manifest. Yeah. So like that's a painful experience. If you're having the experience of all of your faults being made manifest at church, what do you say to somebody who's just like, they are dreading Sunday?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I have a good pep talk ready for that. I think, what has worked for me, because I'm not the most sociable of people, right?
I don't know about that, Terrel.
In small numbers. My wife is, right? Fiona is. And my daughter has chastised me. She says, Dad, you write so much about Zion and community, and yet you're antisocial. And I said, yeah, but I recognize my deficiency and I'm working on it. So as long as we recognize our deficiency. But I think there was an experience I had just this past Sunday, right, where this fellow I hadn't seen in church before in priesthood meeting, he must have raised his hand 30 times. Oh. And we were off to the side, and the teacher never saw him. Mm. And so finally he just muttered something angrily, and he got up and he was gone. And I couldn't find him. He was gone. And so many of us go to church feeling down or depressed or lonely or unloved or inadequate. And so I have tried to remember how worship is used in the New Testament and the Old Testament, in both times, right, with Abraham's sacrifice and with the Magi. To worship means to give something of value to somebody else. And so I think that there is always an occasion when we can find somebody at church like that guy. Mm-hmm. And if the only experience you try to have at church is to try to make somebody else's experience a little bit better, it's a small thing, and it may seem trivial, but that's what I try to do. I don't expect the lessons are going to be interesting, even my own, or that the talks will be good, but I take the sacrament, and I try to look for somebody that might be having a harder experience of it than I am.
Wow.
So.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you. And I feel like the whole chapter about openness would be really applicable here too. If that's the thing that's uncomfortable, that going in with this idea that openness is always life-giving, and it's okay to just relax into the feeling of being really uncomfortable about what anyone is saying, what any speaker or whatever's happening at church, you can just it's a practice in being open. Yeah. Thank you. That's
okay. I think that's a good place to end it.
Anything else we missed?
Don't think so. You were comprehensive.
We loved this. I feel like of all the things that you've written on, you and Fiona both, that this idea of, sort of defining faith has been the most meaningful for me personally. So I'm so excited about this book. Like, it's so great to have a collection of all of these things that we've heard you say over the years and written, just have it all together. So thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Really excited.
Thank you.
Thanks, Terrel. Okay, thanks so much for listening, and we really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Terryl Givens. And as always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get a chance, we'd love for you to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. It definitely helps get the word out about Faith Matters, and we really appreciate your support. Thank you again for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.